Trees. They're pretty common. If you're making a terrain table, you probably want a couple. I've made a few on the channel, nothing too groundbreaking. But I think these are a little bit special. So here's a video on how to make some coniferous woods. What you're seeing me work with here is the base material. It's 300 milligram watercolor paper. A A6 sized sheet like this will probably net you about 2 big trees with some spare for extras. I want to split the sheet into 3 strips, the small one, a medium, and a large. Each one is then cut into thin triangles, the branches of our future trees. Then we go in with scissors and delicately make them into teardrops before cutting in the needles on the side. Don't throw the mess of paper you just made into the recycling. We're going to reuse it later. The next step is to shape the branches. I wrap them around a tool handle first, then gently curve them and end up with these piles. The trunks are just skewers, simple as. Starting with the big ones, we are going to glue branches on the side of the trunk, going up in a kind of spiral pattern. This is basically the gist of what makes these look like actual trees. While prepping a very large video about terrain, I was looking for a solution to make tabletop pine trees fast, cheap, and durable. I saw a lot of great stuff that looked very delicate or took a lot of time or didn't really look like a real tree, until I ran into a post by Skye Bergson, a great diorama artist who makes everything out of paper. I reverse engineered the look, scaled it up to 28mm, and you're watching the results now. Next up is the coat of varnish glue. I don't have Mod Podge here, so I use another brand, but it's just varnish mixed with PVA. You can make it yourself. Water this down just a touch and the paper will absorb it and become tough enough even for the least careful of players. After a few hours of drying, it's a solid piece, but I need to do something about the top. And as usual, when in doubt, I whip out the putty. I make a dead simple green stuff cone that I shove on top of there, smooth out with lubricant, and then score slightly on the sides. In hindsight, I'd recommend doing this with milliput mixed in. It would have been much easier to shape by hand. We have the trees pretty much modeled. Now it's time to make them into a proper terrain piece. The skewers right now are all the same size, so I trim them to all be a bit different and give them an angle. I cut this scrap of plastic art into kind of a lumpy shape and then glued my trees on top. To give this an adequate terrain look, I'll cover the base and the bottom of each trunk with paper clay. A paper clay like Das is great because it's cheap and it's heavy. It's a great combo that means I can slop it on there and be sure it won't topple so easy. It does contract when drying, so if you're making a larger piece than this, it might warp. And so consider using something else for bulk, like, I don't know, Sculptamold over some XPS foam shapes or something like that. The base is a little boring as is, so I fished some stuff out of my bits box, a dryad piece, and an old shield that I sculpted and didn't end up using. It's not much, but that shield is a cool little treasure for people looking closely. The floor shape is now too smooth, so I splodge on some texture paste, which also allows me to cover part of the bits that I added. And now it's time for our paper scraps to return. You want to get the really fine stuff from the bottom of the bag you saved them in. I think they make a good approximation of the ground texture of coniferous forests. It's an abstraction of bark chips and dead pine needles. Like our paper branches, it's not really gunning for realism. For the next little thicket like this I might grind these scraps a little finer. It's a good look, but I think I can refine it a little more. Painting is up next, and honestly it's barely worth talking about. Everything is primed black. Then over the leaves I put down a deep forest green, and then I progressively mix a little more yellowish green into that and highlight by lightly brushing with a flat brush that's seen better days. That way it's going to create a lot of long green streaks over the base color, which will give a good bit of visual interest. The branch tips are then quickly glazed with the yellow-green and left to dry. I'm leaving the trunks black. I could stipple them tan for a bright coastal look, but I kind of like the dark look as is. I did like a 1 minute freehand sketch on the shield. It's going to get covered in dirt and grime, so I don't really care if it's janky. And then I throw a bunch of flat brown on the base, making sure to hit the bottommost part of the trunks with a watered down mix of that paint. Now over all this I dry brushed a golden brown, glue a tuft or two before the wash. No more than that, there wouldn't really be enough light for flowers and grasses and that kind of forest. This is just a piece of moss. And then yeah, I close it all up with a wash of a rust colored enamel paint, removing some with a brush dipped in thinner after, I don't know, about half an hour. This recipe got me to a pretty good spot for that undergrowth kind of orangey brown I was after. I'm used to painting miniatures, which are all more or less tightly framed portraits. I touched on this in the basing videos, but there's a lot of space to say things in the relationship between the mini and its setting, and obviously terrain works the same. So let's dive into a quick traditional painting example to start off the year right. Here are two very famous paintings. One is Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, painted by Thomas Gainsborough in 1750. A young couple is at the forefront on the left. Behind them is land with, trees, which is what we're talking about in this video. But that land is clearly not just any land, right? This stuff is clearly theirs. They are the wealthy landowners and they are showing off their possessions. Or really, they're warning the viewer that it belongs to them. This was painted just a few years after a famine in England and one in Ireland, a time you'd get whipped for stealing crops. Mr. Andrews here is armed, and though he is in a relaxed pose, the context makes it almost like a taunt, right? Just try and walk on my land and you'll see what happens. Remember the mega rich light bending guy joke in Disco Elysium? A guy so wealthy that physics bend around him? Well, this painting does something kind of similar, because you see the land the Andrews owned doesn't actually look like this. If you went where Gainsborough would have stood to get this big tree and the bench, not all the stuff in the background would be in frame. The Andrews asked to have all of their property crammed into the frame. They wanted to wrap the world around them as the ultimate sign of ownership, nonchalantly standing off to the side while reality contorts around you. The trees here don't matter. What matters is the figure's impact on the trees. Now, the other painting is The Oak at Flagey, painted over a century later by Gustave Courbet. Like a lot of Courbet joints, it's also got a weird historical background, but it's not what's interesting to me this time. What interests me is that it's basically a portrait of a tree. Painter is looking straight ahead, the tree is at eye level, yet it is so large that it bursts out of the frame of the painting. Where in the previous one, two rich assholes were warping reality around them, here we're invited to look at the weight and size of said reality. There's a dog too here, running after a rabbit. The hunter is implied to be around, but the painter doesn't care. He cares about the tree. The size of the action is dwarfed by the trunk. You might not even have spotted it at first. It goes by quick. The tree, it stays. It's old and will be here for a long time still. A portrait of a tree was certainly a bit of a provocative gesture on Courbet's part, tied with the tree's historical significance in his eyes, but also because of how detached it is from what we saw in the previous painting. This thing exists, and we are just standing here in its awesome presence. Hopefully this was some good food for thought when you make terrain next time. Perhaps you'll think of bending buildings around the purpose of the minis inside, or perhaps you'll let a piece be a thing that players have to bend around and poke at to see what they can do with it. This was originally part of a big video on terrain, like I said, but it wasn't fitting in with the rest, so I made it a quick one shot that also let me have a video out in January. If you thought the trees in this were cool, I hope you make a bunch of them and show me so I can sue you for tree infringement. And if you thought the bit about painting was interesting, go check out my back catalog because there's more of that around. Thanks for lending me a bit of your time. Yeah, see you around.